Part 2.
Now, CCTV of the attack was played during the sentencing hearing. Axel was absent, of course. You can only imagine what would have happened, or what would have been the atmosphere had he been there. He would have surely had his head bowed and hidden when this was played, as he did most of the time. But can you imagine him watching this with the Aguiars, Alice's parents, in front of him, looking into his eyes? And in fact, the footage actually showed their daughter, Alice, staggering out the building. I believe Leanne Lucas, who was the yoga teacher, we're going to talk more about her in a minute, she fled the room in tears at this point. I think perhaps it was the sound of the girl screaming that was more potent than the video, I don't know, but it brings to mind another famous case, the Moors murders. I did mention them in the last show because of the perfect mugshots, the evil mugshots. So they killed a girl, young girl, I think she was about 10 maybe, called Leslie Ann Downey. And they'd actually made an audio tape, which is obviously very sick. They'd made a tape, and there's this poor 10-year-old girl pleading with these two adults to stop. And the reporters in the courtroom who heard that just said, you know, they would never, you could almost say their lives would never be the same again. And I believe it with the reporters who saw this CCTV of Southport. You know, a lot of reporters are probably, journalists are probably quite cynical about the world, with good reason. You know, they've seen so many terrible things happen. They know that powerful people lie, all that kind of thing. But that all goes out the window when you see or hear something like that. Your natural humanity comes out. And as I did say, Sarah Jane Mee, the presenter of the Sky coverage, did kind of break down at one point. Now, in terms of use of pictures of Axel and drawings from the court, there are a number of drawings. Another picture that they keep using is a drawing, in fact, of him with a very kind of sour, defiant, and I would say evil, but sort of nasty look on his face. But there are other ones where he looks pretty terrified. And if it's true that he hadn't eaten or drank for however long because he's too scared someone's going to poison his food, you know, these are things they never talk about. But this idea that he's strutting around the courtroom, rubbing it in people's faces, he's scared shitless. There's no doubt about it. He'll be in fear pretty much every second of the day. And he probably has been ever since he was arrested. Now, we've all had thoughts of, you know, oh God, what did I do? You know, maybe involving alcohol when you're young, or you do some ridiculous things, or you do some nasty things perhaps, and you wake up the next day and you think, oh God, was that really me? Now, we don't know, as I've said already a few times, we don't know what's in his mind. Has he had remorse? The fact he doesn't show it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And I think part of him not being able to face the courtroom might have been shame or embarrassment. It's not just cowardice, you see, it's a number of things all at the same time. Has he had that epiphany? Has he had that, oh my God, what did I do? Don't know. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. Now, in April, there was a very emotional event, which is when the fathers of Elsie Stankham and Alice da Silva, the aforementioned Sergio Aguiar, they ran the London Marathon. It was in late April, raising money for projects set up in their daughter's memories. Now, when Sergio crossed the line, he collapsed in his wife's arms. I mean, it's a very moving video, clearly both crying with a mixture of relief at finishing. I mean, a marathon is no small thing. Now, from the interviews or statements that the two dads made, obviously they were running for their daughters, but I think their mentality was always that I'm going to finish this race, and it doesn't matter how much it hurts, you know, physically, I mean. Perhaps it was a small victory for these two guys, knowing it's for their daughters. One of the bits that really choked me up was Sergio said that he had been talking to Alice during the race, and oh God, this is just so poignant. He was quoted as saying to his daughter during the race, he said, I know I should be helping you, but I need your help to finish this. So he was talking to his poor daughter and asking for her help. I mean, if that doesn't choke you up, I don't know what does. So, I mean, that was a poignant day. I'll put those videos in the show notes because, I mean, there is a slight ray of light in those videos. They're quite inspirational for a start. Now, I mentioned earlier that since the sentencing of Axel, or really probably since the attacks, there's been all kinds of mainstream and alternative media people weighing in, making videos, talking about it on various shows. Now, there's a woman called Charlie Bentley Astor, who I think is a journalist, and she's been on a few shows on YouTube, and she was on the Heretics channel, which is run by Andrew Gold. Her main angle seemed to be about them being Rwandan refugees, and she apparently couldn't find any details of the family in electoral records and other documents. So she's quite suspicious about that. But there are a couple of things she said that didn't really sit well with me. And again, it's nothing personal. I'm never going to meet this lady. I'm sure she's probably not going to be listening to this. I don't know. But she said that there had been a rumour that when Axel was arrested, he whispered to the police, "I did this for Allah, don't hurt me." Now, I think Charlie said that she didn't believe this rumour. But my question would be, so why mention it? What's the point of saying, "Oh, I've heard this rumour. He said, I did this for Allah, don't hurt me." She didn't name who it came from. "Oh, I've heard this rumour," but I could say, so I could go on a show or I could tell you on this podcast, "I've heard a rumour that he shouted Jesus forever when he was killing children." I'm not going to give you my source. So why mention it? Is that just for content? I don't really understand that. She mentioned another thing that she did believe was more plausible, was that he was covering his face in court and wearing a mask because he was smirking. Now, again, what do I know? I mean, I'm just guessing, but I just don't see that. I just don't see how even someone who's done something as extreme and completely unthinkable as what he did would, even 6 months later, find it really amusing that the victims' families are in court, obviously going through pain that none of us can really even imagine unless you've been in a similar situation. So again, I don't know why mention it, and what's the point? I mean, this is the thing nowadays. Someone can just say something on an alternative media show, and it might plant a seed in someone's mind that there's some chance that he did say that. But you could literally say anything. If you could say, "Oh, I heard a rumour," I'm not going to give you the source. I could say, "Oh, I heard a rumour that 10 minutes after saying he was glad they're dead, Axel actually said, 'I'm very sorry they're dead,' to the police." The police haven't confirmed it, but it might be true. I could say that. Now, again, there's nothing comical about any of this, but slightly comical. Peter Hitchens, who was actually one of the first people to, after Lucy Letby was convicted and condemned as a monster for, 14, 15 whole life sentences, he immediately said, I remember watching a video of him saying that he thought the conviction was very doubtful. So he's done great work on Letby, but he believes Axel Rudakubana's change was due to cannabis. Now, if you've ever heard Peter Hitchens talking to Russell Brand a few years ago, when Russell Brand's whole thing was about being in recovery from drug addiction, you'll know that Peter Hitchens doesn't really know much about drugs. He's probably heard that if you consume enough cannabis, it can cause psychosis. And that could be true, if someone's smoking 10, 15 joints a day. But the idea that Axel Rudakubana would change from almost like a choir boy or a child actor with a very cute face to what he's now become and what he did due to smoking joints, okay, fine. Some have blamed Amazon, of course. And I think I said in the last show, I've got no love for Amazon at all, considering some of the practices that go on in their factories. But again, just blaming them. We're actually going to talk about when the knife was ordered from Amazon. I've got something to say about that later, some details. Others have mentioned misogyny because it was all females he targeted. I'm not sure about that because Plan A, as we know, was going back to his old high school, which I believe was mixed, was boys and girls. There's been all kinds of speculation. And I mean, it's interesting to speculate. And I don't claim to have the answer, but I think sometimes, I think we're all guilty of this. We fit the events to what we already believe. Now, I want to get to another part of this story that I'm very sceptical about. I'm sceptical about the "I'm glad they're dead" quote. I'm sceptical about a couple of other things. I think it was in May, it was reported that in Belmarsh prison, Axel Rudakubana had thrown boiling water on one of the prison guards and sent this guard, obviously screaming, to the hospital, and the guard had recovered. Now, let me tell you why I find this very suspicious. Shortly before that, Hasham Abedi, who had helped his brother in the Manchester Arena bombing, which I'm sure if you're in Britain you would have heard of that, 2017, he had just been transferred to Belmarsh, and he had done a similar attack, in fact more horrendous attack. I can't remember the details, but I think it was hot oil perhaps, what they call a napalm attack. I think that's what he'd done, and he'd improvised a weapon and attacked a guard as well, stabbed a guard. So he's just been transferred to Belmarsh. A video I watched by a guy called Ricky, who's actually an ex-con, so he does know what he's talking about in terms of prison life. I don't know whether he'd actually predicted it or he'd said they're probably going to be like minds, they're going to hook up somehow, and it could happen, and then it happened. So then Ricky said, well, I told you that was going to happen. Now, let me tell you why I'm very sceptical about this. Okay, first of all, it seems fanciful that Hasham Abedi would go into Belmarsh, they'd be allowed to hang out. Despite what you've heard, surely Axel is under fairly close scrutiny all the time. The idea that they'd be able to talk to each other, and Hasham Abedi would say to Axel, hey, I've got a good idea, Axel. Why don't you throw boiling water on a guard? The reason is because I don't believe Axel Rudakubana is stupid. Okay, he might be evil, but I don't think he's stupid. Those two things don't have to be linked. So he's in Belmarsh. He knows he's going to be there for the rest of his life. The only people that are stopping him from getting an absolute pasting, he could get a napalm attack himself, could get stabbed, an eye for an eye. The only people that are stopping that happening are the prison guards. And Axel Rudakubana, for some reason, is stupid enough to think that it would be a great idea to throw boiling water on a guard. See, this is the thing you got to understand, folks. The story is police are investigating an alleged attack with boiling water by Axel Rudakubana on a prison guard in Belmarsh. Now, okay, I understand when something is almost certainly true, they have to say alleged. But we've never heard anything about the police investigation. Where's the second part where they say whether they think it actually happened or not? Basically, alleged attack, everyone just believes that it happened. Mainstream media, alternative media, whoever it is. I just don't believe that this guy would be that stupid. And even the story, as is always the case nowadays, had a couple of different versions. One is that the popular one was that when they opened his hatch to give him his food, he chucked boiling water in a guard's face. But why? Why would he do that? What is he getting out of that? Okay, in some warped way, you can understand the attack he did on the girls. He's getting some thrill, some adrenaline rush, some control, whatever it is. What's he getting out of this? Absolutely fuck all, except to make his life, which is already surely going to be hell anyway, just 100 times worse. I was saying that there was another version where he was on the stairs. Now, of course, he was given a kettle. People have rightly pointed out that's the system's fault, whether you say Belmarsh or the prison system at large, that he's given a kettle if he did it. Okay? I think, if I had to bet my life on it, he probably did do it. Well, even though I've just basically laid out why I don't think he did it, but I mean, I don't know. The other reason I'm suspicious is that, again, it just seems like he's just doing it because he's evil and he thinks it would be fun and he wants to exercise power. And if it turns out that that's absolutely proved that is true, then okay, I'll accept it. But I'm just very skeptical. And of course, people want to believe it's true. That's the thing. The level of hatred for this guy by outsiders, not insiders, but outsiders, is so massive that they just want to believe everything evil about him. Kind of a follow-up story. I think it was after the boiling water attack. The first story was that he was going to be under Hannibal Lecter-style supervision, which is basically just 5 guards watching him the whole time, or 5 guards escorting him everywhere, anytime he wanted to move anywhere. I don't imagine he'd be moving very far, but suddenly, out of this boiling water story, I think it was like a few weeks later, he'd got his privileges back, and the word cushy was used. Then we heard that, he had like, I don't know, £20 a week or whatever it was, I don't know, to spend in the tuck shop in the prison. And probably the saddest thing about this, I don't mean sad in an unhappy way, sad in a kind of pathetic way, was watching an MP in Parliament talking about, Axel Rudakubana gorging on Snickers, Pringles, Kit Kats, whatever it was. The fact that an MP has now taken this story that almost certainly came from The Sun, because most of these Axel Rudakubana stories come from the tabloids, usually from The Sun. But of course everyone believes it. The Sun never lies, obviously. But this MP just using the word gorging, and it seemed quite pathetic. And then we hear that Axel's got Freeview TV with 15 channels. And if you saw the documentary or series that Ross Kemp did about being in Belmarsh, he went into one of the windowless, featureless rooms in Belmarsh. And he said, if I spent an hour in here, I would go absolutely mad. And so you have to also assume that on top of his autism and everything, Axel was probably losing his mind anyway, just being in that prison and know he's going to be there forever. Or maybe he'll get moved to somewhere that's almost as bad. And he knows what's going to happen to him. I don't believe he's stupid. I think he was probably well educated and well brought up to the age of 12. Yeah, again, all these media stories, they're kind of framing him as extremely devious and extremely in control. And the idea that any life in Belmarsh is cushy is just ludicrous. I mean, I've never been in there, but I mean, I've seen videos of it. I've read books about prison. I've heard this guy, Ricky, talking about prison. There's nothing cushy about it. The idea that he's sitting around watching Freeview TV and eating Kit Kats and I'm having a great time at the taxpayer's expense. I mean, that is ludicrous. But yeah, it all feeds into this stoking of anger. And I think I mentioned earlier about Talk TV. I used to listen to Talk Sport, actually, when it wasn't only sport. Now it's pretty much all sport because they've got I think there's a Talk Radio. I've lost track a bit, but Talk Sport used to include non-sport, as I said. And I remember they had a phone-in about the Yorkshire Ripper. It was either an MP talking about he should be released, or it's something to do with, maybe it was one of the attacks on him because someone famously blinded him in one eye with a biro. There were numerous attacks on him. But all I remember from it was just the DJ having the phone in, just stoking these people's anger. And Talk TV are doing that as well. Really quite, I think, shamefully, but from their perspective, shamelessly. And it's just so open. There's no nuanced discussion to be had about Axel. It's just, he's evil. They even did a video, he's worse than the Yorkshire Ripper. I mean, how can you compare Axel Rudakubana and the Yorkshire Ripper? The Yorkshire Ripper was doing it for 6 years, completely different context. Axel did one, obviously, more than horrendous, frenzied attack. And what does it matter, just making people angry anyway? Is that bringing back the 3 girls? I don't think so. You know, let's imagine there's a video. Okay, someone releases a video in Belmarsh of Axel being beaten up, beaten to a pulp by either prison guards or other prisoners. You know, that would be all over the media, and they'd be Talk TV and other outlets similar to that would be cheerleading it and stoking anger. And of course it would be framed as entertainment. There's another video of Axel Rudakubana having the shit beaten out of him. Tune in tomorrow for another one. You know, it'd be that kind of thing. And I mean, how long before people had enough of watching those videos? You know, they might like the first few videos, but there's a point where, I don't know, they'd either get bored of it or actually, perhaps in some weird way, people's humanity would be tricked by suddenly thinking, well, maybe this guy deserves a few beatings, but does he need to suffer every day? I don't know. Maybe there was some human instinct that even the most irredeemable people don't deserve to, to just suffer continuously. I don't know about that. I'm reading my notes here, but I am freewheeling a little bit. And as I said, I'm very tired. It's getting late and I'm just doing my best here. Anyway, the other thing about it is that the victims' families who have the most right to want to see him suffer. But I get the sense that when you're that close to it, I think you feel, you know, as I said, Sergio Aguiar felt angry and perhaps even betrayed that the fact that Axel couldn't face it. But I think somehow you rise above it if you're right in the middle of it. I don't know if anyone remembers a woman who was a fashion buyer, and her name was Merlin Nuttall. And in 1992, she was at a bus stop in Brixton on her way to work, I think on her way to a meeting or something. And a guy was pleading with her and said, "Can you please come into this building? You know, my wife and baby are there and they're in trouble." It was something like that. And it was obviously a ruse. There was no wife and baby. And what he did to her was definitely comparable. It was the same level as what Axel did to these kids. But in fact, possibly even worse, because this guy, his name was Ferreira, after he'd brutalised Merlin Nuttall physically and sexually, he set fire to the room that she was in. They did a Crime Watch special, Crime Watch file. People in Britain, certainly of a certain age, will know Crime Watch UK, but they did a Crime Watch file special, and it was all about the investigation. And at the end of it, the real Merlin Nuttall, because they'd been an actress, the real Merlin Nuttall turned up at the end. And in fact, I read her book as well. She said at the end, "I don't hate," his name was Antony Ferreira, "I don't hate Antony Ferreira because he's a person that in normal circumstances I would have absolutely nothing to do with, because I think he was a crack addict. He lived in a world of violence, and that was just so removed from Merlin Nuttall's world that," she said, I don't hate him, like I said. I thought that was incredible, and I thought that was a very, what's the word? I don't know. Not mature. I don't know what word I'm searching for, but a sort of refreshingly, almost like a philosophical way to look at it. There was also, I think just a few months ago, there was a 15-year-old boy who was found guilty of murder, and the victim's mother expressed sympathy for the killer. And I think she described him as confused and was implying that he was a victim. As I said earlier, I hesitate to use the V word with Axel, but I wonder, had the attack not been so brutal and such, as the lady in the audio clip said, sustained sadism of a level that hardly anyone can believe, really. You know, had Axel done something, say at 15, and it was just he'd swung a knife at somebody a couple of times, which wouldn't have been great, obviously. Perhaps the killer's mother, in that sense, would have said that, you know, "Oh, Axel's a very confused young boy," which clearly he was. When we eventually get to the inquiry, you'll see. But I think, as I keep coming back to, the nature of the attack is such that just doesn't apply. You know, you can't have sympathy with him. He just went way beyond that. Now, going back to this media angle, this guy Ricky, he's got a channel called Behind the Bars TV, and it's just a quick example of how media stories are created. He posted a video, I think it was speculating on what would happen to Axel. I think he may have mentioned the Hannibal Lecter style security, or it was something he said, and then the Mirror, the Daily Mirror's website, ran the story. And essentially what Ricky said was that they'd taken the story directly from his video and said, "Ricky Colleen told the Mirror, blah, blah, blah." And Ricky said, "I never spoke to the Mirror. They just watched my video," and then put "Ricky told the Mirror." It's just like an example of how a story can be created and how it can be misleading. Now, we know that with mainstream media, everything, as I said, is sound bites, but also the frustrating thing is that everything is 5-minute interviews, and it always seems to be a few superficial questions. "Oh, I'm afraid we've run out of time." And as I said, the aforementioned Talk TV, I should say I do like some of their coverage of various things. They do have a kind of alternative bent. But again, all their videos are short, and it's always, there's no deep analysis. It's just, we run out of time. So they talk about mainstream media as something that they're apart from. But are they really? Piers Morgan, who was linked to Talk TV, he does do long-form stuff on Piers Morgan Uncensored. So it is possible that mainstream media figures who decide to go a little bit alternative, they are able to do that. I had a look through newspaper headlines and some titles of videos related to Axel Rudakubana. Here we go. So these are all him in Belmarsh prison. Axel Rudakubana ready to attack again. Bribed police officers to get his luxuries back. Special treatment. Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Protected in prison. Friends with Hashim Abedi. That's the Manchester Arena bomber. Wins back cushy prison perks. Rewarded for bad behaviour. ready to attack, hunting his next victim. Warns he'll attack again, getting an easy ride in prison. And then slightly more, realistic and useful, prison monitoring downgraded before attack. So apparently they'd given him a bit more freedom before this alleged boiling water attack. Hellish life with prisoners queuing up to attack him. Number one target. So I definitely think those last two are accurate. But the impression is given that he's got some power and, as I said earlier, is somehow manipulating those in the prison. I mean, the power he does have comes from his age, because he's technically a young offender, and the fact that he is a special case, because the only upside of doing a crime as extreme as his is that the authorities must think that he's so fucked up that because he's so vulnerable to attack from others, that actually gets better treatment. So there's a kernel of truth. He's getting slightly better treatment than someone who had done an attack that wasn't quite as horrendous, and especially if someone was older as well, if they're a fully grown adult. And those who've done the worst crimes need to be assessed more closely, and they get, protected in some way, because Ricky said on his channel, no prison wants an attack on Axel Rudakubana to be on their watch. So Belmarsh don't want it to go public that Axel's been attacked. Now, I mean, any freedom that he may have in prison is due to the British prison system wanting to appear humane. But, I mean, other freedoms given to him, such as having a kettle or Pringles to gorge on or Kit Kats, that's on the system. But it's framed as if Axel Rudakubana is evil for gorging on Kit Kats and Pringles. The guy is going to take whatever he can get. People have been perceptive enough to say the guy's got nothing to lose. Which is kind of true, but then again, it's not true, because before he apparently did this boiling water attack, he had the protection of the guards to lose. This is why I'm saying the idea that he would do something as stupid as that, now if he did do that, he really has got nothing to lose. Like I said, survival is everything. We don't know what we'd do in a situation where our survival was at risk and we had nothing to lose. Would we kill or attack? And also in prison, the only way probably to avoid being attacked is to attack somebody else. So what I'm talking about is that you've got journalists in these nice, warm, cushy, let me use the word cushy, studios, just talking about Axel Rudakubana as if they understand the situation he's in, or they're judging it by the standards that they would have in their present situation, not a guy who's been in the worst prison in England for, a year now, and is the most hated prisoner. This Ricky actually put on, I think he had a video saying most dangerous, but he changed it to most hated, because he said he's not the most dangerous. And I agree with that, because, why can't they just put him in solitary and take away all his power? They can still do assessments of him. They've got the power to take away all his power, if you know what I mean. The other thing about it, actually, I forgot to mention, was Tommy Robinson did an interview. He was in Belmarsh, quite possibly getting treated a lot worse than Axel, in fact, because he's political, and it was determined that nothing that Axel did was political. It was purely personal. I mean, not personal against the children, because he didn't know them, but personal to him, if you like. Tommy Robinson reckoned that Axel had never been in solitary and was actually a cleaner, or was doing chores, doing cleaning. That's another interesting detail, but again, that's on the system. That's not him cunningly finding a way to avoid solitary. If they want to put him in solitary, what the fuck can he do about it? Nothing. It's on them. So, the Southport Inquiry, commissioned earlier this year. There were 2 days in July. Then they adjourned it until September. As of recording now on the 19th of September, it's been, about 2 weeks. Now, the inquiry is basically, I don't know how many phases I think officially it's just one phase. This is still the first phase, but for me it's basically, we've had 2 or 3 weeks of impact statements, which really for me the only value of those, because we already knew what had happened, was just for the victims to release both information and emotions. So if it's done for the victims, then of course I'm absolutely fine with that. But I was wondering when the inquiry would actually switch to talking about what they're really there for, which is to try and find out why this happened and whether it could have been prevented. In the opening statement of the inquiry, they basically sum it up as well as anyone can. What Axel Rudakubana did on July the 29th, 2004 was catastrophic, inhumane and heartbreaking. Now, short of getting an explanation from him, which I don't think we'll ever get, all the inquiry can really do is gather evidence to find failures and implement changes. They've decided not to use his name, they're just referring to him as AR. And a work colleague joked to me, is that why you're so interested in this? Because you've got the same initials. I think back in July, his brother Dion, as I said right at the beginning, is a couple of years older than him. He had expressed an interest in appearing, and there was a story about him not being allowed to know certain information. He has released a statement, as I said earlier, and I will get to that. I imagine he would appear remotely, but also an image came through my mind. This is almost like an image from a movie, really. Imagine if Axel had a trial and they had wheeled his brother into the courtroom. If you put yourself in the shoes of a victim's family member, how do you feel? We know how they feel about Axel, but how do they feel about his family? Now, we're going to talk a lot about the parents quite soon. The parents, in the eyes of the victims' families, must be somewhat culpable or somewhat responsible. Not for their son necessarily breaking bad, to use a phrase, but in terms of the weapons. We'll get to all that. But I don't imagine that they have negative feelings towards his brother, because his brother is about the same age and his brother is not responsible for Axel's well-being. But that image kind of popped into my mind of him coming into the courtroom for the trial that never was. I think the fact that he is in a wheelchair as well, I mean, that does change the way people look at people. It's, in a way, it's hard to be aggressive towards someone who's in a wheelchair. I mean, hopefully we will find out why he's in a wheelchair. I hope Axel had nothing to do with that. I don't believe he did, but we'll find out. He will obviously be offering invaluable insights, and I've already really decided that I'm going to be doing further podcasts. This might turn into the Southport podcast, Southport Inquiry podcast for the rest of the year. We'll see how it goes. I must credit the Liverpool Echo website for the remarkable detail. They've had a blog going every day of the inquiry with regular updates. So what I'm going to call phase one, it started with testimonies, as I said, from injured people, victims' families. Like I say, from a sort of outside perspective, it's almost piling on the agony before we get to the actual point of the inquiry. But if it's somehow healing for them, then, as I said earlier, I'm completely on board with it. Mrs. Stankham, as I said, Elsie Stankham's mother, is demanding accountability. And the three couples, the parents of the three who actually died, they gave evidence on the same day. And there's quite a striking, let's say, photo of them either going into or coming out of the inquiry. Jenny Stankham actually said, quote, "The issue runs much deeper than the weapon that was used. It's about the root causes, the drive, the intent, and the series of failures that allowed it to happen." So this is why I'm going to say again, I think that sounds like they have risen above just having blind hatred for Axel. They are trying to look beyond. Now, in terms of the effects, I mean, I probably don't even need to tell you how all these people's lives, also we've got to remember the girls that were stabbed but survived, particularly the girl who was stabbed over 30 times and survived. Alice's mum had contemplated suicide. Mrs. King, B.B. King's mother, is tortured by PTSD, and a natural consequence is that any contact with blood or knives is bringing up just terrible flashbacks. You know, they've had nightmares. I mean, we can try and imagine what they've been through, but we can't really, let's be honest. Their sense of loss is total and will be lifelong. One of them said that, this thing is not going to go away. This is a life sentence, let's say. Axel's got a life sentence, but they've all got a life sentence because of him. Now, thankfully, the three sets of parents, they are still together. The relationships have survived, because you often find in these kind of cases that couples can't stay together because the grief and the stress and the sorrow is just too much. it's too much for the relationship, the collective grief of two people. But, again, we don't know, but it seems to have gone the other way in these cases. It's brought them closer together, it seems. Now, some other negative effects, apart from the obvious ones. Leanne Lucas was this yoga teacher who did behave heroically. She'd already been stabbed, and her only thought really was to try and get as many of the young girls out of the building as quickly as possible. She has said that she's been shunned by her community, much as that is a very disappointing and sad thing. I mean, I had a friend in London who told me that he had full-on depression, not the way people use the word depressed now very flippantly, but he'd had full-on depression for about 2 years, and he'd lost a lot of friends, and it wasn't because they were bad people, it's because they just couldn't handle it. And I think that's probably what's happening here. There was a lady who was an assistant to Leanne Lucas called Heidi Liddell. She hid a girl in a toilet with the killer banging and rattling the door. I mean, can you imagine that? Knowing that any second that door could open and that killer is going to use his knife probably on both of them. But from the perspective of an adult, thinking that he's going to use it on the child that you are in this toilet with trying to protect. She suffered online abuse, as has Leanne, as has John Hayes, who was the man, I think he was the manager of a company in the same building. He tried to tackle the killer but was stabbed a few times. He behaved bravely as well. And again, if you just take his statements, he's a fully grown adult. He was stabbed possibly 3-4 times. He's had major trauma, even having a relatively minor injury as an adult. So you can imagine what the young girls who survived are going through. And one of them was in this One Day in Southport documentary. Very, very brave. One of the victims summed up the thoughts very well. Flashbacks, nightmares, and huge feelings of guilt. And one mother described deciding to hang out the washing before going to pick her daughter up. And of course, the thought that's going through her mind is, had I not hung out the washing and arrived a couple of minutes earlier, could I have saved my daughter? Of course, this is not a rational thought. It's a thought brought on by extreme grief. To sum up, I mean, the trauma of all these people, the families, the injured, the people that helped as well, the bystanders, is unimaginable and, is impossible to fully get over. The inquiry has revealed further details of the attack, but let me make it clear, these are not details of the actual stabbings, so you're not going to be hearing any more details about that, I promise. However, Axel had been searching on X, formerly Twitter, a knife attack on a bishop in Australia, possibly to, I don't know, it sounds so awful, but psych himself up. There's a video of him pacing up and down outside his house before leaving to catch the taxi. I'd been wondering for a while about the taxi driver, whose name is Poland, that's his surname. I can't remember what his first name is, but he obviously caught Axel on camera, we knew this, entering the building. And I always wondered, did he hear screams? Did he leave? And it turns out that, in fact, yes, he basically gave up on trying to get the fare from Axel, and he went to reverse out to basically leave. And I think he saw 2 girls, possibly 3 girls, the first 2 or 3 girls running out. Hard to know, but possibly the first few that came out of the building were not actually injured, because they must have obviously seen what was happening, and maybe they found a way of escaping, but maybe they had been injured. Maybe they were covered in blood. And Mr. Poland basically left at that point and didn't call the police until 12:46, which is basically exactly an hour after he left Axel. He took other fares in the meantime. Now, Mr. Poland has put it down to shock. I don't know whether we'll be hearing more from him, but there was another interesting and quite distressing thing that was said in the inquiry. Quote, "The general common law rule is that the only obligation on the state and the private citizen is not to make things worse." So essentially, Mr. Poland wasn't obligated to do anything, even if Axel had told him what he was about to do. That second point is a little bit of a moot point, because you would have to believe that the average citizen would have done something if Axel had told him. Yes, there was fear. Mr. Poland may have been in fear, because if you watch the full video of the taxi ride, and when he's following Axel, he's not shouting anything terrible at him, but he does call him a name, and, obviously maybe worried that he's going to come at him with his knife. That's kind of understandable, but, had Axel told him what he was about to do, which obviously he wasn't going to do, and he'd done nothing, that would just be on him. But that was quite an interesting insight into you could say the limitations of the law. A couple more details about the building. In fact, the main door was open as it was a fire door and used by multiple people. If you see in the video, as we said, Axel knocks on the ground floor door, can't get in, and then just suddenly sees this open door. And that's another aspect of this. Presumably he wouldn't have known when he was master planning, saying sarcastically, about this, that he would have found an open door. How would he know? Did he case it out before? I just can't see that. Maybe he did, I don't know. So the doors between the upstairs studio and the landing were unlocked for the girls to go to the toilet. So he was able to get into the main door, and then the door to the studio he was able to get in was just either open or not locked. Now, they've actually established very, very precise timings. The first girl fled out of the building just 38 seconds after Axel entered the studio. And as I've said, the taxi was reversing out. And Leanne Lucas, the yoga teacher, who'd already been stabbed multiple times, called the police less than a minute after the attack started. So she was very badly injured, but was managing to shepherd young girls out the building and also call the police. Quite incredible. Sergeant Gillespie arrived at 11:57, and the audio I played at the start of part 1 with this fellow called Joel Varit with him. I think that's Sergeant Gillespie because he's the first one. Then I think I mentioned right at the beginning, the other guys were a PC and a PCSO support officer. They arrived with a taser 20 seconds later. They used their knees and a baton to bring Axel to the ground and then applied a taser. So we were saying earlier about this video when he's arrested, he looks very passive. Well, he would have definitely been pacified because an average taser transfers up to 50,000 volts. Okay, phase 2, what I'm calling phase 2 of the inquiry, is all about Axel Rudakubana, his parents, and the authorities in these years leading up to the attack. So we're basically looking from 2019, when the trouble started, to 2024. So let's talk about his family. Now, there was quite an interesting thing. This goes back actually to the community aspect. I believe the family lived in Banks, so they didn't actually live in Southport, but it was a 12-minute ride in the taxi, so they obviously lived very nearby. Dion, his brother, and Alphonse, his father, were both in the local paper. I just found this while researching. As I said, Dion is a wheelchair user, and there's a headline on what's called the Free News Report website, how Dion Rudakubana's new wheelchair transformed his daily life. And this is not subsequent to the attack. This is, I think, a while before the attack. There's just a little bit here. What makes this story even more powerful is the way it came together. It wasn't just one organisation or one act of kindness. It was a collaboration of several Rotary clubs who saw a need and responded with action. Alphonse, the father, was in the paper for getting his black belt in Shotokan karate, it's called. And if you take away what we know now, this is quite a heartwarming story. It says, Alphonse Rudakubana has travelled a long road to achieve his black belt. He began his training in his native Rwanda in 1996, studying sport karate for around 3 years and taking his first belts there before moving to the UK in 2002. So it's a kind of quite a heartwarming local story. So I was saying earlier about do communities really exist? This suggests that maybe they do. Yeah, I thought it's quite interesting they've both been in the paper. A neighbour who went on LBC, James O'Brien's programme, spoke well of Alphonse, but a bit of a warning sign to me was these WhatsApp messages that were published on one website. And we're going to get on to that about Axel using neighbours' addresses to order weapons. And the person who sends a WhatsApp calls Alphonse Al, which suggests some familiarity. And then Al says, I'll make sure he doesn't use your address again. Now, what we knew before the inquiry was that in the house, the living room was an absolute mess. There were machetes, arrows, and other paraphernalia scattered around Axel's bedroom. So even at that point, it was clear that they must have known something. They must have had some idea of the extent of his fascination with violence. This is before the inquiry again. We knew that the parents had called the police on their son 4 times between November 2021 and May 2022. Axel had attacked his father and damaged his car, but apparently nothing was done about the week before the attack. We already knew that. We'd seen another video. Axel was on his way to Range School, and it seems pretty clear that he was going to do the attack there before he changed his plans, because his father pleaded with the taxi driver not to take him. And you can't see from the video that he's pleading. You don't get a sense of urgency from the video, but he apparently told the police. The parents were interviewed by the police directly after the attack, before they were sent to this safe house. And he had said that he had pleaded with the taxi driver. And similar to the audio I played you about the woman in the courtroom saying he was a bit like a stroppy teenager, that's exactly what he looks like. He gets out the taxi, stomps off, slams the taxi door. I get the impression of someone who's not really grown up, who, as I said, was probably pretty well balanced, and at the age of 12 was probably like a pretty normal 12-year-old, but then there's been some sort of arrested development, perhaps. The question was posed before the inquiry, were the parents simply afraid of him? And I will be digging into that and giving my opinion about that in a while. So we're going to focus quite a bit now on Axel's family and also his dealings with the authorities. What the inquiry has disclosed, I believe, came from the original police interview that the parents gave. Seems to be mostly the father who was talking. Now, Axel's brother Dion, I may have mentioned this earlier, has made a statement to the inquiry recognising the, quote, pain, anguish and grief caused by his brother. He sought to distance himself from his brother. It's pretty clear. He's not attending in person due to being wheelchair bound, but he is following remotely. He'll be giving more information at the resumption next week, which will make this podcast somewhat out of date, but I'll be trying to catch up. Dion is 2 years older than Axel and is at university. He said that Axel's behaviour deteriorated rapidly from 2019, and his expulsion and the reason for it was a big part of this. He'd had limited interaction with him in the last few years, but came home from university the week before the attacks and will be shedding light on Axel's demeanour and behaviour in that week, which I think will be very interesting. There's already been some interesting details in this inquiry, but I think what will be disclosed in the next few weeks probably won't give us the full picture, but it will reveal a lot more. There'll be a lot more clues in what is basically a mystery about how this young man deteriorated so much into what he eventually did. Now, I read a bit more this week about the delivery of weapons. Alphonse found a bow and arrow in Axel's room, and he had signed for delivery of machetes. I'm actually recording this portion the next morning, so I'm not as tired as I was last night. But I can't remember exactly what I've already talked about. It's a bit rambling, sorry about that. But the knife used in the attack was bought in Alphonse's name and approved by Amazon because he was an adult. It was addressed to Axel Rud, and arrived on the 15th of July, so that's exactly 2 weeks before the attack. The parents had accepted deliveries of other weapons and then hidden them from Axel. For example, a machete was found with sealed packaging, so unopened, on top of the parents' wardrobe, and another was found under the bunk beds in Axel's room. I'm guessing that he used to share that room with his brother, and then his brother moved out. Of course, the fact that all this weaponry was ordered by Axel doesn't mean that he was planning to use all or most of it. It's the same as all these things about him saying disturbing things about stabbing people or poisoning people. A lot of people say dark things without too much intention at that moment to act on them. Part of it is this strange fascination that he'd obviously developed, and maybe imagining what he could do with them. Remember that the eventual attack was the culmination of 3 to 4 years of simmering rage. He had been violent, as we know, but hadn't done anything particularly violent since 2019. You will hear that he did attack his parents. We don't know exactly how severe that was, but obviously the hockey stick attack on a pupil at Range High School, that was fairly severe. I think he broke the boy's wrist. Now, I mentioned earlier about Axel appearing to be quite polite, even in the taxi, the infamous taxi ride. Another strange detail is that Axel added a note asking for discreet packaging. This may be nothing, but again, if that was exact words used, I mean, that shows someone who is not completely crude, let's say. I'm trying to find a way to say this. I don't know what social class the family identified as, but they don't seem like a rough family to me. Obviously, I have to keep coming back to the fact that what Axel did was extremely rough and extremely crude, but I'm just talking about the years before that. They lived in I've never been to Southport, but we've seen they lived on I think it was called Old School Close, and it just looks like a very, very normal estate, basically. Now, the parents have admitted to being afraid to confront Axel or try to tidy his room. Now, that could be physical fear, as I was saying, or the fear of confronting the situation. Axel is said to have been, quote, quite a force in the household and often violent to his father. Of course, children always have a certain power over their parents, and the parents actually did use the word disempowered. Now, I'd be very interested in it if any parents are listening to this, particularly if they have, for example, teenage children. How much would you be in denial if this was your son? I mean, at what point would an intervention be the only option? Would you hesitate to call the police on your child, even for something relatively serious? In terms of the schools that he went to, of course, he went to special schools after he was expelled or excluded from Range. A general criticism of the system that is coming out is that in the case of children, it's designed to protect children from harm more than focusing on them posing a risk to others, causing harm to others. A teacher of Axel's has talked about being hit with red tape when trying to take steps with him, and the general feeling is that the different strands weren't put together, the dots weren't joined. Of course, the general level of bureaucracy in the world has gone up remarkably, if you want to say in the last 100 years, which of course is a blink of the eye in terms of how long humans have actually been on the earth. But we've gone from relatively disorganised for virtually all that time, or perhaps you could say hunter-gatherer tribes, for example. They did have a certain organisation, but I'm talking about in terms of, say, paperwork. We've gone from relatively disorganised to more organised to what we have now, which is being absolutely swamped in bureaucracy. I've got here not a perfect timeline, but some rough chronology. So April 2019, so this is actually before the trouble started. Axel was referred to, I think, what is known as CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, but we'll call it CAMS from now, aged 12, because he was nervous around crowds and prone to anxiety. So as I did say earlier, the first warning signs were not related to him being violent to others. They were just him having a nervous condition. He was later diagnosed with autism, which we've already talked about, but he was also tested for ADHD, but found not to have a diagnosable level. It was around this time that social anxiety turned to an interest in violence. He obviously was bullied to some extent, and as we've said, possibly with a racial component, and he started to act out and say disturbing things. He was referred to CAMS again after the Childline incident. I mentioned that earlier, just in case you don't remember, if you're not that familiar. He called Childline, which is a phone line that children can call if they're in distress. And he said, what do I do if I want to kill someone? From May 2019 to May 2020, he had 21 sessions with Parenting 2000, which is a support charity. He expressed feelings of anger and not being listened to, re the bullying. Now, I've got here December 2019, but I thought he was actually expelled in October. But anyway, late 2019, let's say. While in detention at school, he said to the teacher monitoring him, "That's why teachers get murdered." I do want to point out again that we have to be careful of not piling on him and projecting on him because of everything he said. Young people do say a lot of things that they don't even come close to acting upon. So him simply saying things doesn't mean a lot per se. Having said that, that is quite disturbing. That's quite an extreme thing even just to say. Now, the hockey stick attack that I just mentioned at range, this is after he'd been, I use the word expelled. I think the American word excluded is the one that most people use, but I'll use expelled for now. Was on a random pupil who may have got in the way, though the intended target was the person who'd bullied Axel. So, without wanting to jump forward, the attack that he eventually did at the Taylor Swift workshop, as far as we know, he didn't know anybody there and had no personal gripe. So it seems like what's happened is that he did intend to attack the people who had wronged him. He ended up attacking a random pupil, and then that became almost, I don't know, his modus operandi perhaps. We have COVID and the lockdowns, of course, 2020, where certain services were suspended or drastically reduced. There's also been speculation about underfunding. I mean, I wouldn't even call it speculation because clearly a lot of medical and social services are underfunded, which is also a part of the Lucy Letby story regarding the Countess of Chester Hospital. You know, was Lucy Letby scapegoated to hide this fact? That's the question that I believe may be answered, probably not this year because we're in September, but maybe 2026. June 2020, Axel saw a social worker face-to-face and engaged in sessions including No Knives, Better Lives. Summer 2021, he was prescribed a beta blocker for anxiety. Now, a beta blocker is used to treat hypertension and it controls the rate at which the heart beats. CAMS were again contacted at this time when Axel was violent to his parents. November 2021, 2 incidents in the home where Axel was uncontrollable and violent but was able to be calmed down. Now, my own feeling here, turning on the parents and blaming the people that brought you into the world is not unusual. I mean, I was a troubled adolescent, nothing to this level, but I had a rage inside me and I turned on my mother really because my father was working a lot and focused on his work. So my mother and I, we're very close now. We're almost soulmates, I'd say now, really. But, you know, we had a few years of warfare, warfare of the middle-class variety. Not with physical violence, but with verbal violence, if you like. And inwardly, I did the same thing. You know, I went through a few years where I realised that I wished that I hadn't been born. So I blamed the people that had made that happen. So that is quite natural for him to turn on his parents. Now, one thing that we did already know before the inquiry, March 2022, he was reported as missing and a knife was missing from the kitchen of their home. He made comments about poison and wanting to stab people. So this is 2 years and a few months before the attack. May 2022, the parents called Lancashire Police at 4:30 a.m. after Axel had woken them up and demanded use of a laptop. When refused, he locked himself in the bathroom and filled the bath until it flooded the room. They told the police that he was severely autistic and hadn't taken his medication for a week. Now, I would probably call it an ambivalent relationship with medication. Obviously, it can work wonders, but when you're on heavy medication, it can produce changes that could be quite scary, particularly if you then stop taking it. So that could be, it might emerge in the next few weeks with this inquiry that perhaps he was on strong medication, because drugs of various kinds, they're the kind of things that can cause someone to do something that is utterly unthinkable, really. About 2002, I was in Ladbroke Grove. I was living there, West London, and I got a new doctor. I said to this doctor, I want something to improve my mood. And this doctor said, have you ever had suicidal thoughts? And I answered yes, meaning very, very vague thoughts of not wanting to be here. As I was just saying a minute ago, you know, not wanting, wishing I hadn't been born and wishing I could somehow disappear, but a very long way from actually doing anything about it. And he prescribed me Prozac, and I took Prozac for about 2 weeks, and I felt so awful, literally dopey, literally in the sense that I felt like I was being given dope. I was being doped. So I immediately came off that, and that was really quite scary, actually. Now, here's a strange detail. June 2022, Axel's doctor requested he be reallocated. This is a female doctor, allocated to a male psychiatrist as she found his dad to be, quote, intimidating and verbally aggressive, and she no longer felt safe. Now, when I first read that, I thought they must have made a mistake. They're talking about Axel rather than his dad, but I did see it reported on another website. So that was what was said in the Inquiry last week, which is quite interesting. 2023, Axel's eating issues seem to have been resolved. And that's quite interesting because, as we know, in that second court appearance, the day he was sentenced, when he was shouting, and people are assuming he just wanted to get out of the courtroom because he couldn't face what he'd done, he said, I haven't eaten or drunk for 10 days. Now, of course, you can't not drink any water for 10 days because I believe you'd die. But, okay, let's say he hadn't eaten for 10 days. Now, of course, prison food, especially if you're him and you're probably quite paranoid about what's being put in your food, that could be a reason. But that's interesting that he did have an eating disorder as well. September 2023, Axel's dad, Alphonse, disclosed that he hadn't left the house for months, hadn't washed for a month, and was spending all his time watching videos online and, curiously, teaching himself their native African language. Now, something that has been in the news, Axel was discharged from CAMS 6 days before the final attack due to his upcoming 18th birthday. And I want to end with this. I've got a couple of other details, but I wonder, 6 days before the final attack due to his upcoming 18th birthday. The central problem for the authorities at that time was that Axel, quote, was demonstrating a capacity and or intention to commit serious violent crime without having crossed the threshold to justify arrest or prosecution. Lancashire police admitted they should have shown more, quote, professional curiosity. Now, just finish the timeline, and then I've just got one more thing to say before we wrap this up. So the week before, we've already talked about he was going to go to range, and his father managed to stop the taxi driver taking him. On that day, Axel threatened his father with a knife if he didn't hand over Axel's machete, or one of his machetes. He had a jerry can and asked his dad to buy him petrol. Axel had asked him if range school was breaking up that day. After Axel got out the taxi and went back in the house, Alphonse stayed outside for 2 hours, but as I've already mentioned, did not call the police that day. And finally, July 29th, his parents thought Axel had gone for a walk when he went out. Police found the packaging for the knife used on the first floor landing with his mother's fingerprint on it. Right, so I'm just going to end with this. As I said, he was discharged from CAMS 6 days before. His 18th birthday was coming up. I don't think it's a complete coincidence that he carried out this attack around his 18th birthday. I don't believe that he was cunning enough to, as I said, plan it to avoid a whole life sentence. But I wonder if the time of the attack was linked to his fear about joining the adult world. Another theory would be that he did the attack to go to prison and avoid basically the big bad world. But as I've kept saying, I think he was an educated boy up to the primary level at least. He would surely have known what prison would hold for him. So I'm not really clear about that. I mean, I'm not clear about any of this, to be honest. I'm just, as I've been reading this to you, I've been thinking about it, and most of the interjections I've made were written down already, but a couple of thoughts have come to my mind. But I'm very confident that I will be bringing out more episodes, because the inquiry, as I said, is going to be fascinating. I know I have to keep repeating, I feel like I've repeated this about 5 or 6 times, that the attack is horrific. But with all that being said, it's also a very good opportunity to find out more information about really a troubled teen gone mad, you might say. But we might learn a bit more about other troubled teens who haven't done this. Because as we said, the inquiry, the main point of it was to try and, is to try and prevent this. Right, with all that being said, I think I've notched up about 2.5 hours in a couple of sittings. I almost wish I'd done the whole thing today, actually, because I feel so much more perky than I did last night. But anyway, I think this is going to be 2 parts, so this is going to be the end of part 2. I'm not going to use the same title because I probably won't be talking much about the media from this point. I think I've made the points that I wanted to make. But we will be continuing, as I said, the ongoing investigation, essentially, into what happened exactly to Axel Rudakubana and how it could have led to the events of July 29th. Now, with all my criticisms of the media, it would be very remiss of me to say something like, join me for more. So I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to use my normal, quite calm, non-commercial voice. That's why I haven't had any success with this podcast. Just not commercial enough, not very good at marketing, just terrible at enticing people to listen. But I feel like with, obviously Glass Onion has got a reasonable audience, but this is very niche. But I think the people that have followed this and have written to me, they really enjoy it. So I've got my own little community. It's fairly small, I think, maybe a couple of thousand people, I don't know. But even that is amazing to think that there are people around the world listening to this content. So I will be back to give you more details about the Southport Inquiry and anything else that comes to mind in the meantime. Now, I'm going to just do one commercial thing. If you would like to help out the show, it's really helping out the show across my own little network, which is Glass Onion on John Lennon, Film Gold, and this podcast, Life and Life Only. If you'd like to help out, I mean, you can do that even just by sharing links. Please tell people about the show, word of mouth, according to Andrew Hickey of A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs, which is a very successful podcast. He says word of mouth is the best marketing. If you'd like to help financially, there are links to Buy Me a Coffee where you can make a one-off donation, and PayPal. So finally, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.